In 1966, Charles Whitman visited several university doctors who prescribed him various medications. In March 1966, according to history, he even told a psychiatrist that he had thoughts of doing something absolutely terrible, and they completely ignored it, and that would lead up to one of the most tragic events in American history. Born on June 24, 1941, in Lake Worth, Florida, Charles Joseph Whitman grew up as the eldest of three sons born to Margaret and Charles Adolphus Whitman. According to Encyclopedia Britannica, the Whitmans' marriage was marred by domestic abuse that also affected their children. By the time he reached high school, Whitman was eager to escape from his abusive home. Despite his academic excellence, he chose not to attend college and instead enlisted in the U.S. Marine Corps in July 1959. According to Crime Library, Whitman's sudden desire to join the military came after an incident in June 1959 in which he came home drunk after a night out with friends. When his father found out, he beat him and threw him into the family's pool. He nearly drowned that night. Whitman left for basic training on July 6, 1959. "He was a good Marine," Captain Joseph Stanton later recalled of Whitman. "I was impressed with him. I was certain he'd make a good citizen." Whitman soon earned an appointment to attend officer training school. There, he proved himself once again and received a military scholarship. In September 1961, he began studying mechanical engineering at the University of Texas. However, Whitman's newfound freedom soon got him into trouble. After years of suffering under his father's domineering rule, followed immediately by the disciplined life of a Marine, Whitman let loose. He and his friends were arrested for poaching deer, and he accumulated an immense gambling debt that he refused to pay off. Meanwhile, his grades were suffering. In August 1962, Whitman married Kathleen Leisner, and it seemed he was ready to get back on track. Unfortunately, his criminal behavior and lackluster academic performance led to the Marine Corps withdrawing his military scholarship and recalling him to active duty in February 1963. Whitman continued his poor conduct while stationed at Camp Lejeune in North Carolina. He got in trouble for gambling, threatening his fellow Marines, and unauthorized firearm possession. He was honorably discharged from the military in December 1964. The catalyst for the sharp decline of Charles Whitman's mental health came in the spring of 1966, when his mother divorced his father and moved to Austin. Whitman kept a journal at the time in which he wrote about his feelings of rage and confusion as he struggled to deal with violent impulses. Shortly after midnight on August 1, 1966, Whitman drove to his mother's apartment to express himself, but he wasn't good with expressing himself verbally, so he left a handwritten note stating that he was very upset, but that he still loves her. Then Charles Whitman returned home. Hours later, around 11:35 a.m. on August 1st, Charles Whitman drove to the University of Texas campus and falsely identified himself as an employee who was there to drop off equipment. But unknowingly to everyone there, this would lead to something absolutely terrible. On August 1st, 1966, when Whitman drove to his mother's apartment to drop off this letter to express how he feel, he also murdered her, and the handwritten note beside her body stating that he was very upset about her death. It concluded, "Let there be no doubt in your mind that I love this woman with all my heart." Then Charles Whitman would return home and fatally stabbed his wife in the chest as she slept. Around 11:35 a.m. on August 1st, only few hours after he murdered his mother and wife, Charles Whitman drove to the University of Texas campus and falsely identified himself as an employee who was there to drop off equipment. Whitman hauled the equipment to the observation deck of the University of Texas Tower, E. Charles would make his way up to the top of the tower so he could have a view of the whole campus, and then he would do exactly what he told his psychiatrist he had thoughts of doing, which was going to the top of the University of Texas clock tower and start shooting people down below. During his training at boot camp, Charles would be qualified as a sharpshooter. So he was very skilled with a rifle, and on the way up to the top of the clock tower, he kills the receptionist and 2 visitors who had been admiring the view of campus. Around 11:45, Whitman began shooting at people on the ground more than 200 feet below. One of his first victims was 18-year-old Claire Wilson, who was 8 months pregnant. The bullet pierced her abdomen, instantly killing her unborn son. Wilson survived, but her fiancé, Thomas Ekman, died beside her. Whitman's murderous spree continued for 90 minutes before 3 policemen and an armed civilian surrounded him and fatally shot him. Within an hour and a half, he'd killed 14 people and wounded 31 others. On the evening of July 31st, 1966, one day before the mass shooting, Whitman wrote what would end up being his suicide note. It began, "I do not quite understand what it is that compels me to type this letter. Perhaps it is to leave some vague reason for the actions I have recently performed. I don't really understand myself these days. I am supposed to be an average, reasonable, and intelligent young man. However, lately, I can't recall when it started, I have been a victim of many unusual and irrational thoughts." In the note, Whitman requested that doctors perform an autopsy on his remains to determine if he had any visible physical disorder that would explain his severe headaches and dark thoughts. He also wrote that he had decided to kill his mother and wife so they wouldn't have to face the embarrassment of his actions. An autopsy later revealed that Whitman had a small brain tumor, though it's still debated whether or not it contributed to his violent actions. The Texas Tower shooting remains one of the most tragic mass shootings in American history. Thank you for listening, and for more stories like this, please subscribe to Office 13 Horror Stories.